So maybe I'll jump right into it. So this session, the title is The Importance of Raising Consciousness Through Inclusive Post-Secondary Education. And the purpose I was sort of trying to achieve through this was to think about how inclusive post-secondary education can raise consciousness of the devaluation of people with intellectual disabilities. So as we move into this session, I just wanted to set the tone. We'll be doing some breakout discussions for a lot of this. And I just want to be intentional about inviting people into a learning space around some of these ideas and the assumptions that we're going to unpack. I'm hoping that through this session, we might reveal some of our own unconsciousness and that can often be a difficult process for people. So just reminding everybody of that, that in this session, it's likely that you'll feel uncomfortable and even challenged, and that we want to make sure this is a respectful place to discuss ideas and remind people that being critical of ideas is not being critical of a person who might hold these ideas. And in the breakout groups, we will keep those groups with the same members so that you could sort of build that very brief sense of community and trust with one another, hopefully, in your discussions. And just like one last reminder that it'll be really important, I think, in our discussions to give space for things not to be perfect, that there will be misunderstandings and probably people will misspeak, and just want to share that that's good and that's okay, because we're going to be talking about some concepts that hopefully will challenge us. So to begin the conversation, there's two terms that I thought were important to unpack because language is used often to describe different things. I just wanted to share sort of a definition of these two ideas. So the first being unconsciousness, and the next being devaluation. So unconsciousness is used in a lot of different ways. It's used in different developmental models and spiritual models. So this, you may recognize Darcy, who was here earlier today. She said she was going to try to jump back in, but I'm just going to jump onto this movie or video to talk a bit about unconsciousness. And this is in relation to social role valorization theory, which is a 5-day workshop you can go to.
This presentation is going to focus on the social role valorization theme of unconsciousness and, relatedly, the importance of developing and maintaining consciousness. When we talk about unconsciousness, we are not talking about the state of being physically unconscious. Rather, we're talking about the mental state of being uninformed or unaware. The part of mental life that really doesn't ordinarily enter our awareness, but, and this is very important, the part of our mental life which informs how we see things and what we do. We can understand the idea of your unconscious by using this metaphor of an iceberg. So if you look at this picture of the iceberg, only part of the iceberg is visible from the surface, above the surface. What you cannot see below the surface is the enormous amount of ice that makes up most of the iceberg, which is below the water. So the tip of the iceberg represents the things that we are aware of. And the rest of the information that we have access to can be likened to the part of the iceberg that's below the surface that we don't see, we're not fully aware of, but it's still powerful and it influences our thinking and our behavior. Let's think about the impact of unconsciousness. Unconscious thoughts, learnings, beliefs, feelings, and so forth, can potentially lead to bias. They can lead to offensive actions towards other people. They can engage even in promoting and engaging in hurtful actions towards others. They can promote fear and anger and aggression without even awareness of what is being done and why it's being done. What is the root cause of our actions? I want to share an example from my own life where I had unconscious things that I had learned that were actually informing my actions, and some of the actions were hurtful to people. So I've been trained as a special education teacher in university, and I've been trained a certain way of providing that special education in separate classes with only students who had disabilities being put together. And I engaged in that kind of education, even though that way of delivering education, even though I saw there were some issues with it, wasn't working all that well. I kept trying and didn't realize how much of what I had learned was so embedded in my thinking unconsciously that even though it wasn't working, I kept doing it again and again until I got challenged by some people who had consciousness of what were some of the problems with providing special education in that way. Challenged by students, challenged by parents, challenged by some other teachers to open up and to think about inclusive education. And I realized that I needed to make a change. I had been sincere, but what I had been doing had not been all that helpful to the students. And in some ways, I had been sincerely wrong. And so when I got those challenges and I began to open up, it changed my actions. So bias and resulting devaluation is often unconscious. You remember the definition of unconsciousness, and I was a perfect example of that. I wasn't aware that what I had learned was so deeply ingrained in me and was shaping my perceptions and shaping my behavior. And when I got challenged, then it was my aha moment and light was shed. And I began to see things differently. My consciousness was raised, and then to do things differently, which was really good for me as well as my students.
So that is what we're talking about in this session when we're talking about unconsciousness. And some other things to understand about unconsciousness is that it happens with all people and in all places. So it is our human nature. We can't perceive everything we encounter and make sense of it. And so a lot of our learning happens unconsciously, and it is a response to complexity. As well, there's social pressures to conform, which can unconsciously have impacts on the decisions we make and why we do things. But what I think is really key about unconsciousness is that it does take somebody to challenge us to raise our consciousness. So I think that through facilitating inclusion at post-secondary, we have the opportunity to do that with people. And that also fits into that idea of leadership for innovation, where we have a shared purpose. And I think if we challenge people from that and we do that in relationship, that's where we can have lasting impacts. Oh, 1 second. The second concept is devaluation, and I'm going to again rely on a video from Darcy here, but I have to jump ahead and navigate Zoom. Okay. So 1 second. Here we go.
Devaluation. So devaluation is the attribution of low or even no value to a person or group of people by another person or group of people on the basis of some kind of characteristic that a person or a group has that is a difference that is perceived in a negative way. And so, for example, when you live with different kinds of disabilities within our culture, that's a difference from other people, which is viewed in a negative way. For example, I'll just speak of my daughter. My daughter lives with Down syndrome. Now, that's a difference from a lot of people in our society. And it's a difference that in the eyes of many people is seen in a negative way. I'm not saying you would view Down syndrome in that way, but many people do. And hence, that then causes the person who lives with Down syndrome or has Down syndrome to be seen, perceived, and treated in a more negative way or devalued, being seen as less than, not as worthwhile as, and so forth. Again, going to the educational experience of my daughter, some years when she was in high school and also in middle school, the teachers would say to me, well, you know, your daughter's really not going to be able to learn that much. So we'll just give her some things, you know, to keep her busy. As if her education wasn't as equally important as the education of the other students within the class. It's a hard thing for us to think about, but actually in our society, there are numbers of groups of people who might experience devaluation and be thrust into a devalued status. So people of color have been talking about this and bringing this issue to the fore recently in a very powerful way. People who immigrate here from other countries, people who are homeless, people who are struggling with addiction, people who have impairments within their bodies and minds. And these would just be some examples of people who are devalued in our society. Now, once you're devalued, okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about the process of devaluation, and we're also going to talk about what are your experiences likely to be if you are devalued. So the universal consequences of devaluation. Well, first of all, as I've said, society devalues certain qualities and conditions. And then there are a number of consequences of that devaluation. The first one being that people who are perceived as being identified with a quality or characteristic that is devalued then become, as I've said, devalued, and their identity, and this is important, gets reduced to that of the impairment. So much so that sometimes people are literally referred to by their condition. So, you know, again, in our daughter's life, there have been situations where literally our daughter was referred to as a Downs. And of course, you know, we have to remind people this is our daughter, Mary, not a Downs. And then along with, you know, thinking about reducing Mary's identity to that of, quote, being a Down, there are all kinds of assumptions about what Mary can and can't do and where she can and cannot go and where she belongs and where she doesn't belong and so on and so forth. And so throughout her education, she had the experience of people embracing her as she was fully included. But at the same time, there were people who really believed the best place for Mary would be to have been put apart and away in special education classes. And when we would try to talk to them, and Mary would try to talk to them about how she loved being in regular classes with the support she needed in order to learn and how that was much better for her, they oftentimes had a very hard time hearing it because they had these preconceived and very set ideas about and assumptions about what Mary could and couldn't do, etc. Now,
so there's a whole long video, and I can link to the whole series that Darcy did around social role valorization and inclusive post-secondary. But the key pieces I think that are important to pull out of that video is sort of that process of devaluation and how people become reduced to an identity of their impairment and how rigid assumptions come out of that, and that it's sometimes difficult for people to see what's in front of them when they hold these really rigid assumptions. And so I wanted to go on, and this next bit is to share a bit of my own story. And it's not because I like to talk about myself, but just to demonstrate that there are these processes and these moments and these key times where we come to new understandings in our life. So my parents always loved to tell the story of how I was conceived when they were working in a group home. So in the 80s, they had established a group home for women who were coming out of large scale institutions. And at that time, there was a lot of effort going into figuring out how to support people to move into communities. I had people in my life who had freely given relationships with others who had the label of intellectual disability, as well as people who worked in paid support roles. So when I was growing up, there was a woman um, who lived with us who had that label. And she was a part of our household, and she also was treated as an adult, which I don't think a lot of people get to experience early on in life. And it really sort of, for me, helped me understand that people age into adult roles, which is one of the assumptions around sort of the idea of a mental age that can be really rigid around intellectual disability. Um, I so growing up, there were people who were part of our lives in really normal ways. And my first confrontation, I think, with devaluation was in high school when I slowly discovered, having taken shop class, that there was a whole wing of my school, and that's where people with intellectual disabilities were. And that it was very difficult to get in there or for any of those students to get out, and that very little relationships or even just like space was shared between um, students with and without disabilities. Also growing up, I got a few babysitting gigs as a young person and free trips to Edmonton, to West Edmonton Mall, to attend the Inclusion Alberta Family Conference, where I got to hear about families who had big hopes and dreams for their sons and daughters and how they were making sure that they were on a pathway towards achieving those. And I think I slowly started to pay attention and became invested in that larger movement to confront the oppression of people with intellectual disabilities. I took time while I was working to complete a master's, and I wanted to look at how the system of total support really encapsulates people. So that was time I took to really think about the assumptions that really make people stuck in a state of like serious oppression. And so I think that there are some very rigid and deep-rooted assumptions about intellectual disability that are held by ourselves in our communities, our institutions, and devalue people with this label in ways that serve to justify practices that otherwise wouldn't be accepted. So we can think about all the horrible practices of congregation, segregation, restrictive, the ways that students, even very young students, are physically restrained, policies that are written about rights restrictions, and it's sort of part of everyday ordinary practice that somebody with this label might have their rights restricted, and that is reasonable. For me, I went through a period of being quite outraged by this, and I was sure that if people could see it, that there would be action taken to stop it. But it became clear to me, as you see these things unfolding again and again, over and over, that it wasn't about people seeing it, but it was about people overcoming the assumptions that made this normal. This became really clear to me when I had a position. I lasted, I think, 2 weeks, but I was training for the role of a relief worker for a large agency that managed group homes in Calgary. And on one of my shifts, I was introduced to a man in his home in the middle of his bath. He was naked in a lift in the middle of transferring from his chair to his bath. And that was how I was introduced to this man. In another home that was designed for people who use wheelchairs, the staff were training me on the tips and tricks of working with that group of people, and that it was okay to drink pop as long as the workers kept their pop up high where people couldn't reach it in the house, because the people who lived in the house were on a very strict diet, and that diet was so that they didn't become so heavy that they were difficult to transfer in and out of their wheelchairs. So I tell these stories not to shock people, even though I think it is shocking. It's very sadly everyday experiences for lots of people. There are lots of people participating in these kinds of things. And it really became clear to me that they don't think there's anything wrong with it. And so that became the new focus. As you can see, I sort of jumped around different roles and how to figure out how to work in the sector. But I think I shifted from outrage to activism when it became clear to me that it wasn't just about telling people what was happening, but showing them why it was wrong. So I was searching for a way to act, and that's, I think, activism is often, we have a picture of activists as people who are like with signs and picketing and doing that. But for me, the activism meant that what I was doing and the actions I took had to challenge these assumptions. And inclusive post-secondary education has been the only place where I've found this to be part of the work that we do. I don't think it has to be, but I'm lucky to have found it. And I think it's such an exciting initiative and movement to be a part of, because we have this opportunity to really get at challenging the assumptions that hold people in oppressed realities. So I'm gonna, I've taken some time to really narrow down 2 assumptions that I think really serve to maintain oppression for people. And so what I'm hoping to do is, given this introduction on consciousness and devaluation, is bring people together in discussion groups to think about these assumptions together. So the first assumption that I think is held by society is that the oppression of people with intellectual disabilities, which manifests as increased poverty, low employment rate, segregation, congregation, higher rates of violence, and poor health outcomes, is a natural outcome of impairment. So I'm going to put people into groups for 7 minutes. And if you guys can sort of discuss the questions of, first, do you recognize this assumption? Do you see it in the world around you? And maybe provide examples of how it's shown up in your own experience. And once you've sort of had a chance to think about those 2 questions, have you heard people use this line of thinking as a reason to exclude somebody, either entirely or in small ways, in your work? So do those questions make sense? Are there any questions?
Arden, can you just repeat them one more time, please?
Yeah. So do you recognize this assumption? And I can type them in the chat. Where has it shown up in your own experience? And have you heard people use this line of thinking to exclude? I think everybody's back out of the rooms. Did you have some good discussion? I don't know if people want to do thumbs up or.
It went by really fast. We didn't,
Sorry.
yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So if this is an assumption that sort of legitimizes practices that oppress people, the opposite of it would be that these outcomes for people are not a natural outcome of their impairment. So I was hoping maybe together we could think about ways that inclusive post-secondary demonstrates this opposite assumption. And if you might have some examples in your work. I think the most sort of like objective one is the employment outcomes that we see for people who've attended post-secondary. I think where they've been measured has been Alberta and New Brunswick. And then I think individual initiatives, like we measure them ourselves, and it is around 80% employment rate, which is very different than the 20 to 30% employment rate nationally for people.
A quick example for me of another outcome, I suppose, is, and this is to do somewhat with, more progressive Canadian policies like RDSP, but also students who go on to employment and have really well-paying jobs where they can actually purchase their own home, or they can live in, really, if you like, typical middle-class living arrangements that they can afford. And it's regardless of their impairment, they're actually experiencing the kind of middle-class life you might expect of someone who's gone to university.
I think too, we see networks of relationships form between students and other students and employers, students and people who work at universities. All of those things serve to safeguard individuals from congregation, segregation, higher rates of violence, and really present a different alternative. So I'll move on because again, I'm rushing, and I appreciate that there's huge conversations we could have around these, but what I was hoping to do is bring awareness to these assumptions. And I think we'll show in the sessions that follow how inclusive post-secondary education presents a different picture of what life could look like in ways that really challenge these assumptions. And we will also have at the end of the symposium on Thursday afternoon, a session where people can break out into self-determined groups and pick topics of discussion. So we can keep these in mind there. If there's somebody you've connected with in your group, you might want to jot their name down. So the next assumption that I think really holds people in oppression is that people need specialized disability-focused knowledge and or training to teach, support, befriend, include, employ, and support the belonging of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So I'm gonna send people back out into your breakout rooms, so you'll see familiar faces, and we'll look at the same 3 questions. Do you recognize this assumption? Where has it shown up in your own experience? And have you heard people use this line of thinking to exclude? So the opposite assumption to the one here is that people do not need specialized disability focused knowledge and are training to teach, support, befriend, include, employ, and support the belonging of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I think there's a number of ways that we demonstrate this through our practice of inclusive post-secondary education. I think in the conversations on benchmarks and commitments, we talked about purposeful leadership and engaging other people to do the work of inclusion. And I think that really helps us stand in contradiction to this assumption. So I'm gonna end with a bright purple slide that can hopefully contrast with the very serious and difficult conversation around these assumptions, and try to sum up how I think inclusive post-secondary can raise consciousness, especially in relation to these two assumptions that are very powerful in oppressing people. And I think it's that we take a relational approach to facilitating inclusive space. So relational approaches are ways of interacting with others that embody core values of respect, inclusiveness, honesty, compassion, cooperation, and humility. And I think those core values are articulated in the commitments and benchmarks. And they're a stark contrast to programmatic approaches. So we talked about programmatic approaches having prescribed logic. You do this and that. And a lot of programmatic approaches seek to identify, prevent, fix, and mitigate impairment so that somebody can fit in. So it puts all of the responsibility of being included onto the individual who has to be managed in order for them to then come back and be included. And I think our approach and the commitment to a relational approach to doing things shifts that responsibility from the individual and onto the structures. So onto the classroom to be inclusive, onto the program of study, the campus community, the larger community, and employment. We invite people to create inclusive space. And we start from that shared understanding of the students we work for as learners, as young adults, as historians, as athletes and employees. So we're pushing back against that process of devaluation that comes to define people as their impairment only. So we start a conversation about a student who's passionate about this and who has this experience and this history that may challenge people's assumptions about intellectual disability. I'm reminded of a conversation through our evaluation with a professor who said, there's a boy on my street who I know has an intellectual disability, and his future was a big question mark to me. And having had a student included in my class, it's become clear now to me that he has a future where he can go on to learn, and one that seemed familiar to this man who otherwise had not been engaged in thinking about inclusion at all, but he got it so well. And I think that's one thing that stands out to me is when we talk about this, it can seem like a really complex thing, but I think when we invite people to do it from this relational standpoint, it becomes more clear what needs doing, and it pushes back against those assumptions. So I'm gonna finish off by just repeating this calculation that I've done a few different times, but I think it just demonstrates the impact that inclusive post-secondary initiatives can have. So this year in BC, we supported 36 students, and we would estimate each student has an average of 3 people in their family. So that means the impact ripples out to affect 108 family members. Students typically take 4 classes a year. So that means there's an impact on 144 instructors in post-secondary institutions. If half those classes have TAs, there's 72 teaching assistants who are impacted. An average class at post-secondary has 40 students. So that accounts for some that are much smaller and some that are much bigger. And so that's approximately 5,700 students that are impacted by our work. And that's not to say that every student in the class interacts or comes to know the student that we support, but they're witnessing and participating in proactive inclusion and are part of courses and programs of study that are recognizing the contributions of students. And what's also exciting is, I think Lori touched on this, is that these people go on to be professionals and leaders in their community who carry forward this new understanding. So we also estimate that about 80% of students will get jobs, which means 29 employers, an unknown number of colleagues will be impacted. And so when we add this all up, about 6,000 people are impacted in a single year by the work of inclusive post-secondary initiatives just in this one province. And I think it's worth remarking on because each person impacted is seeing an individual with a developmental or intellectual disability leading a life in a way that challenges these two assumptions. And I think that the key to this are those relational approaches that build capacity for inclusion in others and challenge these assumptions. So I hope that sets up the stage to make you all really curious and excited to come back tomorrow. And yeah, that's the end of symposium day 1. We will be back tomorrow at 9 and we'll have